A long time ago, there was a grand old stage. It had shiny floorboards and thick velvet curtains and wide wings on either side. At the front of the stage, there was a single music stand, and on the stage itself, there were 72 seats. On every seat sat an instrument. There were French horns and cellos and clarinets and oboes and bassoons and shiny trumpets and beautiful flutes and young violins and even a tiny piccolo with a rather shrill voice. All together, they were a symphony orchestra. But the best thing about the orchestra was the conductor. He loved the instruments. He even loved the piccolo with a rather shrill voice. He had chosen each of them, and he had given them the music. And every day he would walk onto the stage, lift up his hands, and the instruments would play the most beautiful music that you have ever heard. It was light and haunting and rich. It made you feel like dancing, and the dancing would begin in your fingers and your toes and your knees and your hips. Other times it made you feel like your heart was being healed, or you had to smile for no reason at all. Of course, the conductor was happy. He reminded the instruments they could play music all of the time together. That was what they were made to do. But they had to listen to him, to follow him, to watch his hands and play together. If they didn't, if they lost sight of him, they could lose the music just when they needed it the most. Do you think the instruments kept their eyes on the conductor? Well, one day the shiny trumpet was feeling grumpy. He tried to warm up, and his valves kept sticking. It made him cross. And when he started to play, the first violin turned around and said that he was too loud. The first violin had been made the concertmaster that very day, and she was feeling rather pleased with herself. She was even taking a photo of herself on the conductor's podium. Well, the trumpet would not listen to her. Who did she think she was, the conductor? And he would not speak to her again until she said sorry. Meanwhile, the French horn was feeling bored, and he noticed the piccolo nearby, and she was rather cute in her tiny shrill way, and the French horn could not take his eyes off her, which meant that he did not follow the score, and he certainly didn't follow the conductor. And that was a problem. At the same time, the cello was having his own troubles. He liked rules more than anything, and he saw that the flute was 2.5 minutes late to rehearsal. When she arrived, she was all breathy and flustered, and when rehearsal began, she missed her entrance by a whole bar. The cello told the oboe told the bassoon told the clarinet told the French horn told the grand piano sent a text to the trumpet, who was still feeling cross with the violin, and the trumpet told the flute. After all, she should know that she was a whole bar late. The flute went very quiet. She'd spent her whole life not feeling good enough to play the music, let alone be in the orchestra. And now everyone knew she wasn't good enough. A whole bar late. She didn't deserve to be there. And she began to wonder, would anyone notice if she left? That's how the day began. And you might not think it was enough to change everything. During rehearsal, the instruments carried on as they normally did. But that evening, there was a performance. The audience arrived and was seated. The conductor walked onto the stage, lifted his hands. There was a hush, a wait. And the conductor's hands came down, but the music that was normally so beautiful wasn't quite the same. Parts of it seemed missing. It was a little bit clangy. Perhaps something was out of tune. The audience leaned forward. They could hear the melody, but the richness had gone. A man in the audience began to grumble, and he got up and left. The instruments kept playing, but nobody felt like dancing. Afterwards, of course, they all blamed each other. The cello blamed the oboe blamed the bassoon blamed the clarinet blamed the French horn blamed the grand piano blamed the trumpet, and the trumpet was still blaming the violin, and the violin blamed the flute. But the conductor said nothing. He just reminded them that he loved them, and he had given them the music, and they were to play together in harmony and keep their eyes on him, follow his hands. And, as well as that, there was a surprise. In 8 days' time, they had been invited to play in the concert hall of the opera house. Every seat was sold, and the empress, the lady in the red dress, was coming to hear them. The instruments were excited. They could play beautiful music in the concert hall, and the empress was coming. But they needed the music. Do you think they could get it back? The next day, the cello called a meeting. He said, "I've been thinking about the rules. The music has gone because we're not doing enough scales. We need to spend extra time playing all 12 scales in all 12 keys. 2 slurred, 2 tongued, all legato, all staccato, and every articulation. We'll practice them over and over until we get every note perfect, and then the music will come back." Do you think it did? All the instruments stood up tall and played all 12 scales in all 12 keys. 2 slurred, 2 tongued, all legato, all staccato. It took a while. They kept going all afternoon, although the piccolo went to sleep and the big bass drum wondered what was for lunch. The next day, the instruments had another rehearsal. They thought perhaps the cello was right. Scales were good. The brass instruments pursed their lips and the notes seemed outwardly perfect. But when the conductor lifted his hands, the music still seemed not quite right. Even with all those scales in all those keys, it wasn't really beautiful. The notes were correct, but it sounded like noise. They had 6 days to go. The next day, the violin spoke up. She quite liked her voice and her varnish, but she did not like the trumpet ignoring her. So she said to the instruments, "We need to do something lovely, something for us that will bring the music back. We could skip rehearsal, eat out, pamper ourselves." The instruments went out for tea. They ate until they could eat no more, and afterwards they had their wood polished and their bows rubbed with rosin and their keys tuned, and they felt perfectly lovely. The next day at rehearsal, they were sure it would be better. The conductor lifted his hands and they began to play. It sounded full, almost too full, but it was not beautiful, and nobody felt like dancing. There were 4 days to go. The next day, the trumpet spoke up. He said, "Putting it bluntly, I blame the violin. It's all her fault. If she had not told me that I was too loud and pretended to be the conductor, none of this would have happened. We would not have lost the music. And I am not going to listen to her ever again until she says sorry. And by the way, I think we need padding on our seats. Then the music would come back." The shiny trumpet sat down and all the other instruments looked at him. Was he right? Was it the violin's fault? Would padding bring the music back? The next day at rehearsal, they asked rather sheepishly for padding on their seats. The conductor listened to them, and in his kindness he gave them what they asked for. Then he raised his hands in the ordinary way. But when he brought them down, the music still didn't play like before. There were screeches and jangling noises when there should have been sweetness. Padding hadn't helped. And there were 2 days to go. The next day, the flute nervously tried to speak. She said, "I know this is all my fault. I'm not good enough. I came in a whole bar late, and sometimes I feel all breathy and wrong. I have a small scratch on one of my keys, and maybe it is my fault that you lost the music. So I've decided to go away and stay in my case, because you're all better off without me." And the flute left the stage and she hid herself and her gift in her case. The other instruments wondered briefly if they should have said something nice. But then again, perhaps it would be easier without her. And the next day they rehearsed again, expecting the music. But still, the music wasn't beautiful. It was quieter than ever, almost empty without the dance of the flute. And there was one day to go. The lady in the red dress was coming. How could they go to the concert hall without the music? What would they do? And what about the conductor? Had he not noticed? Didn't he care? The conductor had noticed. He cared about the instruments. That very night he went to see the cello, and he found the cello alone, practicing his scales and arpeggios. And the conductor said to him, "You know, scales are good, and so are rules. But a long time ago there were some instruments who were so keen on keeping the rules that they forgot about their hearts. The beat of the music is in your heart. To play the music, clean your heart and follow me, and everything else will work as well. I want you to play from your heart." The cello looked at the conductor, stopped playing scales, and wondered, could he really play from his heart? Then the conductor found the violin. She was busy taking photos of herself and her shiny new wood. The conductor smiled at her. "You are beautiful and shiny, but be careful not to fill up on everything else. The noise of the crowd, the attention, the praise, the way you look in a photo. You see, a long time ago there was a violin who became so enamored by the praise that she forgot where it came from. You're okay because I love you and chose you and gave you the music. So play the music out of love for me." The violin looked at the conductor, stopped taking photos, and wondered, was she really okay? Then the conductor went to find the trumpet. The trumpet was awake, half expecting the conductor might come. And the conductor said, "I know you feel like nobody understands you. To them, you're big and loud and stubborn. But I know who you really are. I made you that way and I gave you the music. You don't have to be worried about seats with padding or not. You can trust me, and you can speak to the violin again, because you know you matter such a lot to me. And when you speak to her, you'll start to see that the things that used to matter a great deal, like being the loudest, will matter less and less, and playing beautiful music will matter more and more." The trumpet was very quiet. Could he really speak to the violin? Finally, the conductor went to see the flute. She was tucked away in her case, not expecting anyone. The conductor spoke very kindly. He said, "I know you think you're not good enough, and you should be more like the violin without a scratch. But I made you on purpose to be you, because I want your voice to stand out and be the one that calls the audience, that makes them dance. You see, if everyone had the same voice, there'd be no music. And if you look carefully, everyone has a mark, a scratch, a dent. So play from your imperfection for me, because I love you and gave you the music." The flute wondered, could she come out again? The next day, the instruments found their way to the concert hall and they walked onto the stage. They felt a bit dwarfed. There was an hour to go before the concert began, and the conductor spoke to them. "I want to tell you one more thing before we start. You can't make the music come back with rules or polish or pretense or even practice, wonderful though that is. The music comes back if you love me and follow me, and if you love one another. But it's hard to do. It's been hard for thousands of years. Even years ago, there were instruments who felt too small, not good enough, and others who were sure they were always right, or they wanted to be the loudest, or they found it hard to forgive. The conductor paused and he said, "It makes me sad. I'd rather lose the music myself than hear you play without the flute. I'd rather lay my hands down than hear you play without love." And the conductor, who loved the instruments and who had chosen each of them and given them the music, and who loved beautiful music more than anything in the world, slowly lowered his hands and he began to walk away. There was silence everywhere. What would they do now without the conductor? What would it take to bring him back? What would happen to the music? You see, for all those years, the instruments hadn't realized. When the conductor told them to follow him and love him, and that if they didn't, they'd lose the music, they didn't realize that in losing the music, they'd lose him. In the silence, the cello put away his rule book and he stopped doing scales. The violin stopped taking photos of herself. The French horn returned his eyes to the score. The flute came out of her case, and the trumpet and the violin looked at each other and whispered one word: sorry. The hour was up. The audience was seated and the concert was about to begin. And just then, the conductor appeared on the stage and he lifted his hands. They stayed there for a moment and came down, and the orchestra played the most beautiful music that you have ever heard. It was light and haunting and rich. It sounded like the sweetness of honey and the voice of the ocean and the call of the birdsong on a summer's day. The audience felt like dancing. It began in their fingers and their toes and their knees and their hips. They couldn't stay still. It was like their hearts were healing, or they wanted to smile for no reason at all. Even the empress in the red dress and the sparkling shoes was drawn into the dance. The applause filled the concert hall. And then the conductor turned to face the audience and he called out, "Does anyone else want to join the orchestra?" In the furthest corner of the concert hall, there was a box of percussion instruments. They'd been left there years ago after a high school musical, covered in dust. They heard the voice of the conductor and they said yes, they'd like to join in. And all those tambourines and maracas and triangles and cymbals and bells came down to the front and onto the stage and joined in. It was beautiful. The applause got louder and louder as more and more instruments joined in. It felt like everybody was dancing. And just before the day was over, the conductor spoke once more to the instruments. He said, "The music came back because you listened to me. You followed me. You loved each other. It was beautiful and the audience danced. But remember, there will still be hard days. And on those hard days, you can talk to me. I'll be here to help you. And one day, there will be a time when the scratches and the dents and the arguments will be gone forever. You will always play beautiful music because the music will be inside you and the song will be called Hallelujah." And that's exactly what happened.